For this week, we're going to be talking about financial management. So before I dive in, I just want to clarify that financial management is a fiduciary responsibility for an organization's board, not the financial department exclusively. So unlike for-profit organizations, nonprofits do not measure success exclusively by their financial results, but rather by the outcomes related to their missions. However, without well-managed resources, the achievement of a nonprofit's mission and objectives is at risk. Thus, without proper financial management practices, the existence of the organization is endangered. So even though that nonprofits may not be measured by their financial outcomes, without financial management, there really is no nonprofit. So in our books, Chapter 14 breaks financial management down into these main components. There's funding, financial statements, financial ratios, developing and managing a budget, and risk management. So for the purpose of this video and the time restraint, I'm mainly going to be touching upon funding and financial ratios, especially because this is what my article is discussing the most. All right. The challenge of funding. One of the most pinnacle challenges that nonprofits face is the challenge to generate sufficient and reliable revenue to meet short-term operating costs and long-term capital needs. Developing a diverse balance of revenue sources is key to the funding plan of a nonprofit. So if we look here, we have some examples of different revenue sources. At the top, we have philanthropic giving, in which roughly 70% of the giving will be given by individuals, and then much smaller percentages then given by states, corporations, etc. We also have, as another revenue source, we have government and volunteer services. This is talking about grants and volunteer staff. And then we also have earned income, which is talking about the product or services. And obviously, because not every nonprofit is going to earn income based off of products or services, they have to kind of rely more on philanthropic giving and government assistance. All right, so utilizing ratios. The analysis of financial ratios can indicate trends in an organization's financial health. So here we have a list of the 4 most commonly used ratios to predict a nonprofit's future financial health. We have profitability, liquidity, asset management, and assessing long-term solvency. So profitability is we're essentially talking about if a nonprofit is acquiring a surplus, breaking even, or losing money. Liquidity is essentially an organization's use of cash. Asset management is how efficient are the assets being used. So, for example, a nonprofit has a building. Is that building generating money? Like, is it making money? Is it losing money? And then we also have assessing long-term solvency, which looks at the relationship between assets and reliabilities. All right, so we have some more ratios and percentages here. These are a little bit different. These ratios have been used to measure efficiency, and in no way, should these ratios measure the effectiveness of a nonprofit. Very important there. Yeah, so definitely, in no way should nonprofits be rated based off of these percentages or ratios. The ratios that we have here are the ratio of program expenses to contributed income, the ratio of fundraising expenditures to private support received, which is the cost of raising $1, the percent of total expenses spent on charitable programs or activities, the percentage of total expenses spent on fundraising, administration, aka overhead, and then lastly, accumulated cash and assets reserves in relation to operating budget. So the one ratio or percentage that we're really going to be talking about today is this notion of overhead, the percentage of total expenses spent on fundraising administration. So overhead is the main concept of the article that I chose today. the article that I chose is from Nonprofit Quarterly, and it's entitled "Why Funding Overhead is Not the Real Issue: The Case to Cover Full Cost." And this piece was written by Claire Knowlton, and I have up here two quotes that I feel best summarize the article. So Knowlton says, big strides have been made recently in the acknowledgement that overhead ratios are poor indicators of an organization's impact or financial efficiency. So going back to chapter 14, it lists overhead as one of these ratios used to measure the efficiency of a nonprofit, and Knowlton is basically arguing to just take this ratio off the list completely. And then also later in the article, kind of to sum things up, Knowlton says, "We've been so distracted by the discussion of whether nonprofits should be able to pay their day-to-day operating expenses and how, including overhead, that we've mostly ignored the need for nonprofits to generate enough surplus to reinvest in the organization's immediate and future health." So what she's talking about here is she's talking about how, in regards to financial management, how nonprofits should focus more of their time on the ratios such as profitability, liquidity, asset management, and assessing long-term solvency, rather than looking at these ratios of efficiency such as overhead. So, so additionally, she talks a lot about progress, about certain progresses, and she has a lot of criticisms. So she talks about how funders, large and small, have shifted grant strategies to fund overhead. This is a pretty progressive challenge in how revenue resources are utilized. Additionally, nonprofit regulators have spoken out against overhead myths. So, for example, Charity Navigator, GuideStar, other nonprofit regulators have already spoken out against the myth that overhead spending is a meaningful way to evaluate nonprofit performance. And then in 2014, she talks about how federal government began requiring federal grants to cover nonprofit overhead costs. Some criticisms that she has. She criticizes the government for setting a pitifully low default overhead reimbursement rate of only 10%. And then she also repeatedly notions that though progress is being made in terms of looking at overhead differently, that we are still quote-unquote not there yet. And as she criticizes, and she also criticizes accounting guidance for being too vague to determine which expenses belong to which function when managing financial statements and setting budgets. And then the last thing I have on here is nonprofit. She talked about how nonprofits spend far too many resources attempting to report their financial expenses. So, in sum, I agree with the majority of things that Knowlton mentions. We watched the TED Talk clip in class, and that mentioned that nonprofits have consistently constantly held only 2% of the market for the last couple of years, and that a larger overhead can produce far more revenue. That donating to overhead is still donating to a cause. That's something we talked about. When nonprofits are able to cover their overhead with flexible funding, they do better work for the communities. Budgeting and bookkeeping financial statements can also be exhaustive to a nonprofit, especially when accounting guidance doesn't account for overlap between programs, like between program and fundraising expenses. So that was going back to the second quote that she was talking about, or not the second quote. That's going back to the criticisms about accounting guidance and talking about the kind of the vagueness. So for the most part, like ultimately, funding overhead can lead to a healthier and more resilient nonprofit sector, and that's something that I'm interested to see in future financial management, to see how overhead really kind of becomes more of a